The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. After feeding the crowd, Jesus withdrew to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. Now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 5 or 6 kilometers, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near to the boat, and they were terrified. But Jesus said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. The Gospel of the Lord. As we journey with Jesus in this season of Easter and his resurrection, the Church enters into a kind of catechesis of the resurrection by 2 main sacraments. First, the sacrament of baptism, and that is what we have been reading about in the last week with Jesus' discussion with the Pharisee Nicodemus. Nicodemus comes to Jesus at night, and he knows that Jesus is doing these great signs. He must be from God, and he wants to know who he is. Jesus responds, "You must be born again if you wish to enter the kingdom," and then explains what that means by water and the Spirit. Water, obviously baptism, Spirit, the Holy Spirit given in baptism. So the whole sacrament of baptism is a sacrament of resurrection because a person is born again from sin, original sin at least, to this new life of grace, and then enters into this church of the resurrection. Well, now we make a transition starting today into the sacrament of the Eucharist. It begins in John chapter 6, where Jesus prepares his disciples for this great teaching he's about to enter into, the Eucharistic discourse, by performing 2 great miracles. One we heard about yesterday, the breaking of the bread, the multiplication of the loaves to feed the thousands. In that particular miracle, and especially in the parallel accounts, we have those action verbs. He took, blessed, broke, and gave. That's repeated not just at the breaking of the bread, but at the Last Supper, and then on the road to Emmaus, all of which are Eucharistic. Then Jesus walks on water, just to show again to the disciples that he controls all of nature. And that's important because what he's going to teach is that he can take nature, bread and wine, and totally transform it into himself, his body, blood, soul, and divinity. Because of these 2 miracles, his multiplication of the loaves and fish and the walking on the water, the disciples now would be open to his great teaching that they, in fact, must eat his flesh and drink his blood, which would be totally unbelievable to them otherwise, because they were Jews, they were brought up not to eat the flesh with the blood, but now Jesus is saying he will take all the Old Testament sacrifices of animals, which were not effective in conferring the Spirit and grace to get us to heaven, and he would then perfect that sacrifice in himself. He would be the priest, the altar, the victim. That was today's gospel from John chapter 6, verses 16 to 21. Notice that the sea becomes rough because of the wind, and the sea in the Old Testament is always symbolic of chaos. Way back in the book of Genesis, we hear about how the earth was covered with water, and the Spirit came to hover over the dark and the deep, the waters, and life comes to be, light. Well, here the sea is tamed by Jesus, who walks on the water. Notice what he says to the apostles as he approaches the boat. "It is I," that's the divine name that God spoke from the burning bush, Yahweh. "Do not be afraid." And those words would be important for the apostles because they were to take this teaching of baptism in the Eucharist and bring it into the Roman Empire. That would be a tall order, but they persevered, and through those two sacraments, especially of resurrection, the Roman Empire was resurrected from tyranny to becoming the seat of the church, where Peter would become the first pope and all the others from that. So we're embarked in this great journey. For the next week especially, we'll be reading from John chapter 6. Let's take in this great teaching and make it our own, so that, as you're doing this morning, we make it a priority every day to receive Christ in the Eucharist and renew our own baptismal vows, so that we can, like Christ, bring the good news to everyone that we encounter.